Hi everybody, this is part 2 of our Evolution Saw review. The first one, if you haven't seen it, was basically an unboxing video. I don't really do a lot of those, but a lot of people like to see them, so I did that, the unboxing and the assembly of this saw, and some of the major features of it, and that was about it. But today what I want to do is I want to compare the two saws, my previous Evolution cold cut saw, which is over here on the table, and the new Mitre saw over here. So obviously, the ability to create miters is the major benefit of this saw, but it has a lot of other benefits because of the form factor of the saw, and I kind of wanted to go over those and compare them for somebody who might be deciding between, you know, the two of these. Depending on what you need to do, it might not be worth buying this lesser expensive one and going straight into this one. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go over the major features of the saw, the pluses and minuses, because I did discover a negative on here that I don't like. But it's not big, but it is something that is, you know, to me a negative. So we'll go over that. And then we're going to get into cutting. And what I've done, as you can see on the table here, there's this brown paper on the table. And I've covered the entire grinding table with this brown paper and put barriers on the edges to catch all of the metallic debris that comes out of the saw. And really that's to demonstrate one of the features I like of this saw over the previous cold cut saw. One of the other things is the previous cold cut saw, no matter where I stand, no matter what I do, I get hit with chips. So they're sharp and they're hot and they hit me. So the hot part of the chip, that's why the saw is a cold cut saw. The heat from cutting is actually removed with the chip that gets cut. So the heat is leaving the object. That's why your material stays so much cooler than an abrasive disc that is constantly just through friction grinding its way through generating heat. But that the original saw is the one that just shoots chips at me everywhere. I've done a couple test cuts with this saw and far less chip ejection in my direction. So we're going to go through, and I've got a piece of stock here. When we do the cutting piece, we're going to do 10 cuts on each saw, and then look at the chip pile that's created and the distribution of those chips to see a difference in how the two saws manage the chip load themselves. Okay, here we are with the original saw, and one of the things I want to go over is work holding in the saw. So the major difference between this saw and the other is that I only have one work holding area. We'll cover that on the other saw here. But what that basically means is that anything I cut off is free hanging on the other end. So longer pieces need to be supported, otherwise you could get a bend during the cutting process, which could impact your cut. So a couple other little things is we come in here, and as we're clamping down, okay, the smallest thing you can actually cut is something about this long. So I'd say about 4 inches, because you have to be past the center pivot pin of the brace, otherwise the saw won't hold stably. I'll show you what I mean by that. So if we were to take a very small piece of material that we wanted to cut and cut something, you know, in half that was maybe only an inch or two long, we obviously have to come out and reach the blade. So we'll put the blade there and we'll put our material in, okay, hold it in place. And now what happens is we're past the pivot pin, and this material can very easily pop out. So you have to have the opposite side of the pivot braced. Normally on a saw like that, we simply accomplish that with another piece of the same stock. So we have a small piece sticking out here, pinched, and a larger piece back here balancing out the forces of the jaw. So we can get around that, but I did want to point that out, that the length of the piece you can safely cut is limited unless you do workaround activities. Okay. Now the second part, as I mentioned in my previous video, is changing this plate for various angles. So, you know, the indicator back here, and if you haven't seen the indicator, just look in my previous video on this. It's in the middle there, and it shows you the indicator, but there's an arrow stamped on this. I'm sorry, there's a graduation stamped on the bevel plate here, and a line stamped on the casing. But this is, it moves a lot. It moves left, right, center, all over the place, and it takes an Allen wrench to readjust it anytime you want to do anything. So every single time I want to make an accurate cut on here, what I have to do is I have to go get my machinist angles. They don't need to be that accurate, but it's what I have around. And I have to compare the angle of this to the blade. Right? And if I want to get a 15-degree cut over and over again, yeah, there's 15 degrees back here, and it's marked there. But if I cut 15 degrees by that line today, and then I come back and I've moved the saw, and tomorrow I need to cut more matching pieces and just line that up, I will almost guarantee those cuts won't match. Okay. Okay, so that's some of the deficiencies on there. You know, the work holding, the clamping. Saw is really good at just cutting stock to length. It does a great job of that. But when you wanted to get at bevels and angles and things, it gets a little more problematic. One of the other issues is how narrow this base is. If you're cutting longer material, you know, I get this in 20-foot sticks. My smaller materials comes in 24-foot sticks. So it's extended out here, and I have to have multiple braces and supports and the whole deal to support that material while I'm trying to do a cut. So a wider base with multiple clamping locations really helps ease that quite a bit. So there's that. When cutting stock like this, it's recommended actually you cut the stock in this orientation and allow the blade to traverse through. And this is because it makes the material effectively wider and it's easier on the blade. So I'll tell you honestly, I usually don't do that. I'm lazy. I clamp it in square and I cut through that. It's more work on the blade. It wears the blade out faster, but it's fine. This saw did have a angle plate adapter for cutting stock in this orientation. I have long since lost it. I've never used it. The saw has been fine without it. I probably just go through the blade a little faster than I normally would, but big deal. So we've got our clamping locations. Okay, we have our bevel problem. So there's a couple issues there. The width problem is a little bit narrow, for as I stated. One of the other problems with this saw is chip management. The chips go everywhere. It's insane. They shoot out the side, they shoot out the bottom, they shoot out the back, they ricochet, they shoot out and hit me as the operator. They just go everywhere. And chip management is terrible with the saw. So I use it, I put it on a table, I sweep it all up. It's just a big mess. But that's probably about the biggest on the negatives. The positive to the saw is it's an excellent saw. It really cuts well. It cuts cleanly, it cuts smoothly from a cutting perspective, but from a fabrication perspective, I think it is highly lacking in a lot of features. So if you just need to cut stock to length, and if the end isn't perfectly square or your 45 isn't perfectly 45, that's fine, and this saw does a great job. When you get into fabrication, those fine details matter. Building trades, generally we don't need to be that accurate. If we're building a steel structure, a small degree, again, like I said in my other video, we can fill that with weld. But when we're doing small items such as table legs and furniture and things, it just doesn't cut it. So I think that is pretty much the overview of this saw. So I'm going to set up the camera and we're going to look at the same things in the other saw and look and see what kind of advantages you get with the miter saw. So I'll pause here, move the camera, and we'll pick up over there. Okay, here we are at the miter saw, the same stock that we were using in our previous example, and I want to show you some various differences. Obviously, right off the bat, you can see how much wider the saw is. So when cutting longer material, I have more opportunities to clamp the stock down on both the infeed and outfeed sides of the saw. So that way I can keep it flat to the deck and perpendicular. So I'm going to get the most accurate cut using a miter saw, which is pretty obvious. That's really what they're for, is more accurate cuts. But even in a square cut, I can get a lot more stable cut with this. So a couple reasons. One being these quick release levers, one on each side. I can clamp the infeed and outfeed side, right? And I do have the bevel adapters installed on these. So we'll be using that for this cut. Okay, if I can get it back on here one-handed, sorry. It wants to spin. It spins quite easily. That's a plus. There we go. Okay. And these nice quick adjust half nuts are excellent. I love this versus cranking that handle 100 times on the other miter saw. Okay. These slide in and out. As stated earlier, one of the problems with that saw is the way that it clamped everything is there was that pivot. This does not have a pivot. This is square and it clamps solidly. So I can take a piece of material, place it in here, and get it right up next to the saw. And you see how close I can get here. So we'll bring the saw down, and that would take off approximately a kerf width of the saw. So I can tighten this thing down against that back wall, and it is rock solid. Look at that. That's really, really solid right there. Right? And now I could cut something this small. That is 2 inches, 2.5 inches. And I probably could go even a little smaller. Because this doesn't pivot, I can bring a smaller piece of stock in and cut something very small on here. Okay, now let's look at when we're going to do a larger cut, and we would have it between 2 braces. So we'll slide our stock over, we'll slide our brace over, and you'll see part of the ability to get so close to your stock is what gives you such an accurate cut. You see how closely I can be, and I can even move this in a little further, and that guarantees that each piece of this is square, 90, and flush all the way across. So that works really good. We're going to loosen these up, and I'll show you one other thing that we can do on here that we can't do on that saw. So the other cold cut saw only has clamping in this direction. On this saw, you can clamp downward. So there's a plus and a minus coming up here. We've got our holes in here, and this allows us to put a vertical clamp on something. So now I can clamp this piece of material in multiple orientations and ensure that it, not only is it held in this direction and this direction, but it's also held from twisting. So this is going to give me very accurate, very repeatable cuts. So that really helps quite a bit in just clamping the material on the saw. So I want to show you one of the negatives I have found with this so far though. So this is great, and I can cut my material and do what I want, and there's a couple positions for this. There's one there, and one here. Okay, these all work great. There are 2 positions on this side. There is a position here, as you can see. Looks like it'd be a great spot to clamp down some material. There is also a position here that again looks like it would be a great spot to clamp down material. However, when you bring the saw down, you run into the clamp long before running into the material. And that happens in both of these locations. Okay, now that could be alleviated by a shorter pin, a few other ways to go about that, but the way it comes out of the box, essentially those 2 locations for this are absolutely useless. There's really no way that you can clamp anything here. I could possibly clamp something much further out from this area because I'm missing the saw body right here. But really clamping material here, there's really no way. And it's habit, I'm right-handed, I infeed from the left. I always do, I always have. That means I will not be able to clamp down my in-fed material from the left. I'll have to flip it and clamp down over here. So to me, that's a major negative of one of the benefits of this saw. But let me restate that. I wouldn't call it a major negative. It's probably the biggest negative I've seen so far. It's not that big of a negative. It is just the biggest one. So not too bad. I can live with that easily. A couple other things to notice. These are all 3/4 inch holes in the deck. So anybody that has 3/4 inch clamping solutions for their fabrication table can reuse those tools with this base. So there's a big investment among the fabrication community in those tools. Various clamps and pins and other sorts of things. You can use them on the base. So that's a great thing there. Okay, so we have gone over some of the clamping information here. Great benefits overall for accuracy, repeatability, and safety. But of course, the major thing here is the miter functionality. And like any miter saw, if I want to go at 15 degrees, I've got a lock in here. Okay. Now, hypothetically, let's say that this wasn't actually 15 degrees, that it was 14.5, 15.5, some off by a little bit. Those small amounts still don't matter mostly in fabrication. They would in the machine shop side, but here pretty much no. But the biggest thing is the repeatability, that every time I lock this at 15, it's got a tab that engages and puts me at the same location every time. So if I cut 15-degree parts on here today, put the saw away, come back in a week and put it back to 15 degrees. I've cut some other things since then, let's say, and I want to come back to 15 degrees. I know that I'm getting the same cut that I got 2 weeks ago. Where on the other saw, it's up to me to align that back platen at nearly exactly 15 degrees, strictly for repeatability, not necessarily for accuracy. So if I wanted to cut parts on there that I need 15-degree cuts, I have to make sure they all come out the same. The only way to do that is to measure every single time if I'm going back and forth to different cuts. And on here, quite quickly, if I needed to cut a bevel and then slide the piece over, so here we would cut our 15-degree, and now I decide I want to slide it over, right? We can just come back over, boom, and I can do a flush cut, I can do a cut the other direction, all without removing the stock, all without having to grab the wrench and change the backing platen. So I could just keep processing out pieces of material through here as I'm feeding in. So if I needed to have a 15 on one end and a 30 on the other, I could cut this 15, then I could slide it over to cut the opposite 30, slide the material through, chop it off, come back to here, boom, back to my 15, slice the next piece, slide it through, back over to my 30 over there, and you see how much faster I can process repeated cuts through this saw. So those features really put this leaps and bounds above the capabilities of that saw from a shop perspective. Again, if all you needed to do was cut stuff to length, and that was pretty much it, maybe the occasional miter of some angle, that one's great, and you can do that with that saw. But on here, I can do quite a few things, and like we just talked about, one of the big advantages is I could actually miter easily on a bevel. So I can clamp the stock in this way. And as I stated, that other cold cut saw did have one of these beveled clamping shoes. I have lost it. But one of the things I still wouldn't do on that other saw is I wouldn't clamp it that way and try and do a miter. Because the clamping force is only here on that edge where the bevel adapter would be, and then a flat piece on the backside. It's not very sound. It doesn't hold very well. I'd be very worried about that level of clamping on some strange angle that I was trying to cut. But on this saw, with the ability to both clamp vertically and horizontally, I feel much safer doing it on this saw. Okay. We can't really compare cut speed on the two saws because they are counterbalanced by a spring, and there's really no way for me to objectively compare those two. The springs are going to have different weights to them. The saw heads weigh different amounts. Even if I were to tie a weight to here and allow that weight to pull down, it still wouldn't account for the various spring rates and weight differences, etc. So I really can't go on that. Also, this is a brand new blade. That's an older blade. So there's too many variables that really go into the speed of the cut. But they're both easy, they don't take any effort really, and they both cut very, very quickly. So I really feel it's a moot point and not really worth getting into. One of the things that is worth getting into though is that chip management. So I've got my safety gear over here, I've got my ear protection, my gloves, and I'm wearing my eye protection. And we're gonna go through and do 10 cuts on each saw. And I'll time lapse some of this so you guys can watch it in real time. Real time. So you can see exactly what we're going to do. And then we want to see the chip distribution. So I've separated the saws by a couple feet. I have a barrier on the back to catch any chips that might want to skim out along the paper. And I have a barrier on the left and the right to retain any chips from that direction. I do not have a barrier in the front. That's sufficient. We just want to see the chip distribution. So I'm going to get this clamped in, get my safety gear on, and we will start doing some cuts here. Okay, there we have our 10 cuts. Okay, and I'm going to move the camera a bit so you can see the chip distribution. Now the chips did move around a little bit as the table vibrated some, but what you can see is in front here, very little chip accumulation, and on the back, a nice pile of chips right there, and a little bit that I've shuffled over here. All right, so 10 cuts, I would say probably 90% of the chips accumulated immediately behind the saw. So we're going to move over to the other cold cut saw, and we're going to do 10 cuts on that saw and compare the chip distribution over there. Okay, here we are back at the original cold cut saw, my old one, and we've got the table clamped at approximately 0 degrees, so as close as we can get. And we're going to go ahead and clamp in that same piece of stock. Now you'll notice when I cut on the miter saw, I cut in this orientation instead of the recommended orientation as an angle, and I did that intentionally to put the playing field as even as I could between the two machines. So we're going to go ahead and put this one in, get it lined up with our blade. There we go, and we're going to clamp it down and do 10 cuts. Okay, there we go, 10 cuts on each saw, and as you can see here, we have a much greater distribution of chips from this saw. There's forward, rear, it's almost evenly distributed all over that entire area. It shook into piles from the vibration, but you can see the distribution, all right? And of course, some of it's straight down, but the majority of it is to the right of the saw. Very little is behind the saw. So I'm gonna move the camera. I hope you guys don't get motion sick from this, but I wanna show you the back. So you can see there's very little material behind that saw, a great deal of it here, and I can tell you, I was hit by far more particles from this one, all over my left arm, my right arm, chest, head. I just get pelted by particles routinely from there. So now let's come over to the new saw and take a look at the difference here. So we can see, obviously, far fewer chips on the front side. But when we look to the rear, what we see is a great collection of chips down here. And one of the reasons for that is in the very back of this saw. Right here is actually a collector that as the chips are being thrown to the rear, they hit this cup and then they can fall downward through a hole in the back. Larger pieces will collect right there. Very easy to get to, okay? But the chips are easily collected and put right down there. And that, to me, is a huge, huge win without having to have chips shooting all over the shop and especially pelting me. I can't stand that. It drives me nuts. So from the safety perspective, I personally believe that the Mitre saw is a safer saw. Really from the clamping perspective and the reduction in debris ejected back towards the operator. Okay? This saw works fine, and these have been in use for a very, very long time. So don't get me wrong when I'm talking about safety. I'm not saying this is inherently dangerous. I'm just saying the other saw has more safety features available. I do really prefer the chip ejection on the Mitre saw. It's going to make this table much more effective without shooting chips all over the place, because obviously a chip that doesn't land on the table is not going to fall through the grate and get collected. It's just going to go somewhere in the shop. So that'll help significantly. I really hope you guys enjoyed seeing the differences between the two saws. If there's any other comparisons you want to see between these two, comment down below and I'll do any comparison that I can. So again, thank you for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed this video.